All right, so how many people here know what Gamma is? Raise your hand. If you don't raise your hand, you have certainly interacted with Gamma without knowing it, in either a slide deck or a website. Gamma has become the most popular, coolest way to use AI to basically generate slides, sites, presentations, and a lot more. I wrote about Gamma early with Upstarts Media, which is my media startup. If you guys are like, who the hell is this dude? I was a tech reporter at Forbes for 12 years, where I wrote a lot of the tech cover stories at Forbes you might have read about companies like Stripe, Canva, Snowflake, etc. And I left to start my own company to write about cool, up-and-coming startups that maybe aren't obvious or aren't quite getting that big media attention yet. At Upstarts Media, it is free to subscribe. I got to do my own hustle because I'm flying back to New York after this. Alex got me to come out. So it's free to subscribe at upstartsmedia.com. And it's my pleasure to talk with Grant because one of the viral early stories that we covered at Upstarts earlier this year was about how Gamma became, I think, one of the best examples of a lean startup building in a very different way from some of the speakers you've heard today or yesterday who are about hyper growth and sort of like raise and build and land grab as much as you can. Gamma has one with a very different approach. And so it's my pleasure to have you here, Grant. It's gonna be a fun chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to meet everyone. I'm super excited for this.
So when we talk about a lean startup, I think it starts with these really impressive metrics for Gamma, which everyone should be paying attention to these numbers. I think it's revenue per employee, revenue per dollar of venture raised. Where does Gamma sit there right now, Grant?
Yeah, we're definitely far above $1 million of ARR per employee. When we look at things like how much we've raised, we reached a milestone of lifetime negative net burn, which means we have more money in the bank than we've ever raised. And we intend to continue to run, super efficiently, try to be scrappy, no matter how big we end up becoming.
That's awesome. And so you were at Optimizely with a lot of your team, and you guys went through sort of the highs and lows of more traditional startup kind of venture-backed growth at Optimizely. And I think that really informed how you guys took a different approach with Gamma. So could you talk a little bit about sort of the origin story here?
Yeah, so a lot of our early employees came from a company called Optimizely. Optimizely was an early YC company. And I think that sort of generation of startups were all kind of built the same way. You hit product market fit, you end up trying to blitz scale the company, you really grow pretty aggressively, pretty fast. And just for comparison, if I were to kind of compare where Gamma is today relative to what Optimizely was back in the day, we're 1/10 the size, right? Like, so they had 10 times more employees at the same level of traction. And so when we started Gamma, we had...
But not just that, I think it's important to note what you told me for our article, which was Optimizely had what might have seemed like a really good exit, from the headlines, from like what you guys would Google today, but it was a mixed exit for actually the employees, right?
Yeah, so, for a lot of the early employees, because of the exit, the outcome wasn't as great as what we would have hoped. And what that means is like oftentimes early employees, even if they were to exercise their options, you might actually lose money at the end of the day in transaction. Like the taxes, everything else that you're actually on the hook for ends up being this thing where you believe that the equity was going to be worth something in the future, but it wasn't. That was my own personal story. Joined as an early employee, joined at our Series A before we were even 100 employees. And ultimately, the outcome wasn't great. In fact, it was actually negative in terms of actual value. And so when we started Gamma, really from day one, we wanted to have a fundamentally different approach. If Gamma is going to be successful someday, then every employee should win. They should be a shareholder that benefits from all the upside. And so we're going to do everything we can to structure in a way that is as employee friendly as possible. And that's like in the details. When you think about the ability for early employees to build an early exercise, or what is the post-termination exercise window for these employees. Every one of those details we cared a ton about because we knew it mattered. And even though in the beginning your equity is worth nothing, you do that in preparation so that, again, if Gamma is successful, everyone's successful.
I think that's so important to stress because it's kind of like the beginning of your superhero arc in my mind, the contrast to the supervillain arc, right? Where, like, I don't know if any of you have worked at startups before your current investing or your current startup. Like, my wife was employed for at a startup. She also had her startup get acquired, and we got no money back from the shares that she had to purchase within 90 days of leaving the startup. So you could argue that we were net negative on that acquisition. And I think this is kind of the unspoken reality across a lot of the tech industry, right? We just don't glorify that.
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate reality is, you'll have some startups that do really, really well. Outcomes are great. Employees are all celebrating. But as we all know, the vast majority are not going to have that outcome. And so the stories of people putting their money up, exercising their options, the company not working out, nobody ever hears about that. And so, and that's probably more of the common case, or the more of the story that more people are actually familiar with if you were to actually go out there and ask them.
So that's the meta, and we can get back to a little bit of how how you structure Gamma's employee kind of I guess incentivization there, and we can talk about that in a sec. But let's also talk about just how you came up with this idea, because when I was still at Forbes, I guess 2 years ago now, at sort of the beginning of the ChatGPT craze, I wrote about a company that had raised a ton of money called Tome, and it was supposed to like win AI generated slides, and like there was a lot of momentum, and Gamma kind of starts to creep up into my conscious as like people are like, hey, maybe you wrote about the wrong company here, but you were not like the first buzzy company in this category. What led to you kind of settling upon this product and this sort of line of attack from a couple ideas?
Yeah, so I started my career in consulting and investment banking. So I lived in slide decks most of my career. The last startup I was at was acquired. I actually went back into more of a consulting and advisory role. I was advising a lot of startups, and I was using Google Slides as my medium of, hey, I'm going to present to you, share my findings, my proposals, and whatnot. And honestly, it was like one late night staring at this Google, a Google slide, trying to figure out, how am I going to format and design this thing by tomorrow so that it doesn't look like I didn't spend any time actually on the work? And just this realization that there's got to be a better way. So what ended up becoming that sort of realization was me calling up two of my former colleagues. They were still optimizing at the time, saying, hey, what if we try to reimagine presentations from the ground up? What if we can come up with new primitives, new building blocks? And so we ended up spending 4 or 5 months, nights and weekends, just designing the initial prototype of what eventually would become Gamma. That prototype actually is what we used to raise our pre-seed round. So instead of Google Slides, we used our own prototype to raise money. And I think along the way, it just built conviction that there is this massive category around helping people be visual storytellers, where the incumbent tools were invented 30, 40 years ago, and we can come up with something completely brand new.
But still, the Optimizely A/B testing heritage came through a little bit, because didn't you kind of A/B test whether you were in the right path with your product?
Yeah, totally. So, this was peak pandemic, so 2020. We knew we wanted to do something in the sort of communication space. Like if we could change how people communicate, that we believed would unlock other things down the road. And so we actually had two ideas that we were sort of A/B testing simultaneously in the very beginning. One was this presentation tool. So how could we reimagine presentations from the ground up? The other was actually a virtual office. So again, this is peak pandemic, hybrid work, virtual work, people working across the globe, and we were like, wouldn't it be nice if there was a virtual space for people to collaborate as if you were in the same office? That would change how people communicate as well.
Which several startups ended up pursuing and raising a lot of money, Rome being one notable example. But this did become a product, right?
This did become a product, and it was a category for sure. And so we ended up doing 6 months of parallel pathing both. We were building both simultaneously. We'd actually dog food both every single day. And at the end of 6 months, this wasn't a very scientific A/B test. It was just asking ourselves, which product category did we have more conviction for? On the one hand, we had presentations where we literally had like infinite number of ideas. We were like, oh, there's so many different ways we can improve this. And on the other hand, we had this virtual office product that was delightful to use, but ultimately it was competing against the one thing that was really hard to compete against in real life working environment, right? Like the ability to sit next to someone you actually enjoy spending time with, tapping them on the shoulder, collaborating, going to a whiteboard. That's ultimately really, really hard to replicate, and it would never be something we could surpass in our opinion. And so we decided, hey, rather than focus on something that we were kind of capped in our own ambition and our own conviction, let's move into something that felt nearly infinite in terms of the possibilities.
Obviously, there were and still are a lot of companies that offer deck generating or presentation generating, whether it's Canva or it's some of these website builders trying to move, like pretty crowded market. What resonated with investors early on, and with sort of key hires you were trying to bring in? Like, how did you convince them that Gamma would really hold its own in what is not like a unique, like stealthy secret market?
I mean, early on, investors are obviously just trying to bet on a team that has an ambition. And for us, we were also able to demonstrate, even with a scrappy team, being able to generate that initial prototype, something that felt real and tangible. So a lot of them are just kind of, indexing on that. Is that something I can believe in? We knew coming into this category that there's a graveyard of presentation startups, right? There's many that have attempted it, failed, or maybe plateaued after a certain number of ARR. And so we knew that if we were going to give ourselves a chance, we're going to have to take a very big swing. And a big swing means let's not try to be incrementally better slideware. Let's try to really try to reimagine the building blocks from the ground up. So instead of fixed 16 by 9 slides, what if you had something that could lean into medium that's immediately mobile friendly or mobile responsive by default? What if it was interactive? What if it was multimedia rich? All of the things that traditional slides are not. And so that's kind of the foundation of, okay, let's try to be something that can serve a truly underserved part of the market, because the incumbent tool just cannot do what we can do.
I'm not sure if you still do it at the scale you're at now, but one thing I loved learning about Gamma was how you made new hires dog food the product. Like giving random presentations using Gamma. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So dog fooding for sure is just something that's core to our DNA. So we do this thing every Friday. We just had this, which is we call Gamma Rama. Anybody in the company can go up and present on any topic. It could be, longevity. It could be, your favorite hobby. It could be your favorite trip. And it just gives you a chance to kind of really see the kind of breadth of things you can create in a tool like ours, but then also feel the pain yourself when you can't do the thing, like if you can't drag an image in a certain place. And so that weekly sort of feedback across every single team member in the company means that you have good intuition. Like, what are things that we wish could be in the product? And that could be a proxy for things that other people wish could be in the product as well. And then certainly, yeah, all new employees or candidates are applying. Everyone has to create a presentation. And again, it's the same thing. It's like, can that person empathize with the problem? Are they excited about the mission? These are things that we think are incredibly important. No matter what kind of company you're building, like, you want your employees to really be on board with what you're trying to build.
I think it's also a clever way to learn more about your colleagues, especially with a new hire. Like I would probably do a presentation on like why I think Tom Brady is a vampire, and you would learn that I'm not a Patriots fan. And then I think at the same time, it's also like backdoor debugging, right? Like you see what's breaking.
Totally, yeah. And both are equally important. Getting to know your teammates, and then also, again, yeah, servicing bugs, things you want to fix, all like in real time.
So, okay, so you're building this product, it's going well. How do you kind of stay differentiated, stay ahead of the wave as it's easier than ever to sort of maybe get feature parity, or like you have these big companies, whether it's Notion or Canva or even Google, being like, oh, I'm not allowed to, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse here, but oh shoot, Gamma has come out of nowhere and is now really popular. We should have the same experience.
I mean, there's a variety of things you try to do. As a lean startup or a relatively small startup, one of the most important things you should never give up is like that relationship with the end user or the customer. For us, as soon as we had people repeatedly using the product, we started forming what we call the Gambassador program, which is a small community of our power users. They get all pulled into a Slack workspace. We have ongoing, regular, often daily communication as to, hey, what's working well, what's not. If we're shipping a new feature or even prototyping a new feature, they're the first ones that get access to that. And so I think that just over time, again, it gives you like kind of this open relationship with those customers and users, allows you to really get instant feedback when needed. They're the first to file a bug or report a bug when it happens, and then you really get to build alongside them, for as long as possible.
So just kind of delighting the customer, staying faster to execute like what they need, that keeps you ahead of the more resourced competitor, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think the other piece of this that over time, as the user base has grown, we've really architected Gamma to have experimentation at the core of what we do. So obviously, not surprisingly, from a company that was started from many ex-Optimize folks, everything we do is really how can we test something, not assume that we know what's going to be best for a user, but test and iterate.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, everything from the initial sort of onboarding experience, like what does a user have to do to get to the first draft? There's many different things you can offer in terms of, hey, should you show them like how they pick a theme first? Or should you default to certain settings? Should you choose certain models to power different parts of the experience? all of those can be tested. And when you're at scale, all of those things should be tested so that you are constantly learning what's actually best for each segment of user, and then hopefully over time are optimizing that entire experience.
Awesome. And so then we can circle back a little to sort of how you build Gamma. There's a previous speaker today that I was talking to was this new sort of Corgi Insurance, very Y Combinator alumni, young founder tapping into this like cracked engineer or hustle sort of vibe. They were arguing that you should be working 7 days a week on your startup. You should be getting tattoos of the startup logo on your body. What's the vibe at Gamma? And like, how do you sort of see this hustle culture in Silicon Valley right now?
Yeah, I mean, what I do appreciate about that is like you do want a group of super passionate, committed people to build your startup. You cannot succeed if you don't have that. But I do think you benefit a lot when that feeling is very organic and authentic, right? You're trying to build something that people are genuinely excited to show up to work, and they're not looking at like the clock, like I have to be here 996, 997, but I enjoy it. I'm going to deliver my best work because of that. So we definitely have a team that's working really hard. We have a team that's mostly based in San Francisco. People come into the office. We do believe a lot in in-person work at our stage. But we also believe when, I started my career in investment banking, so 996, that was, it was definitely working more than that. But everyone around me, we would all burn out, right? Like when I look around, very few people lasted for many years. If you want to build a startup that's going to be enduring, that cannot be the case. If you're building a startup where it is a revolving door because people work their butts off and then burn out and then leave, then in my opinion, that's a harder way to build something that can be long-term, enduring, and sustainable. So we probably have, I would argue, some of the lowest, attrition rates ever from an employee standpoint. We've had only one employee ever leave on his own, and he left to start his own startup, and he's a serial entrepreneur, so I do not blame him for that. But it's like, if you can do that, you benefit so much from the continuity, the tribal knowledge you keep within that company. And 5 years in, like if you still have that, you have such a solid foundation to continue accelerating development, where I don't think that's possible if you are in a mindset that I'm just gonna treat an employee like burning them out and then move on to the next when they're ready to leave. That's just a hard way to build, in my opinion.
Do you think there is any sacrifice of ambition in sort of building a lean startup that focuses on profitability and sort of a sustainable long game there? Or how do you reconcile that approach with like big outcomes and high ambition? Because I think what you would hear maybe from some of the YC set today is that if you're not trying to be 0 to 10 or 15 to 100 and all in on a land grab, you will be left behind. And so I'm curious like what you see.
Yeah, we don't believe those are at odds. We are on that trajectory ourselves, and for us, we've been doing so in the sort of maybe anti-VC playbook, which is we've been doing it profitably, we've been doing it with a lean team, we haven't had to raise money, and so I think you can play your own game, right? You certainly can run that playbook where you hyperscale, blitzscale, whatever you want to call it, but maybe that's not the only path. I say certain markets, maybe that is probably a more viable path, or maybe the only path when it is truly a land grab. But I'd say there's very few markets where that's the case. If you're in a situation where you're the Uber versus Lyft and you have to go after the land grab, then yeah, be prepared to be that type of founder that needs to raise a ton of money, needs to work at this for many, many years. Uber worked 13 years before they were profitable, and that's the sort of long game you need to play. But most markets, most categories, I would say, are not that. And so don't fool yourself into having to play that game if you're not in a market that dictates that.
Awesome. Obviously, a lot of startups are getting going really fast these days using a combination of like vibe coding and agents. Are you guys using those tools internally as well at Gamma? And sort of would it look similar just at bigger scale? What's happening under the hood?
Yeah, we're using it all. I'd say where the vibe coding apps have come into play, they're kind of slightly augmenting what we were already doing. So a lot of our designers know how to code, so they are already coding functional prototypes. That's been from day one, pre any of the vibe coding. Now we have, we can do some of those in vibe coded apps. We can also do that in Cursor. And so depending on what tool the designer wants to use, they have access to way more. But I'd say if anything, it's maybe added like 10 or 20% efficiency to what we were already doing, which we found valuable. It's just it hasn't necessarily transformed, for instance, like how the designers work.
I'm curious your reaction to, there was an interesting paper that just came out of Stanford that posited a new term called work slop. Has anyone seen this before? Raise your hand if you've heard of work slop. Okay, a couple people. So the idea is basically this is the office equivalent of AI like visual slop. You know, like the dumb images you see on Twitter or LinkedIn that are clearly AI generated, low effort specifically, not commenting on AI art overall. And the idea with work slop is that there's basically low effort AI work that is passing the buck to other employees to kind of clean up. And I'm really curious kind of how Gamma approaches like elevating people's work versus enabling work slop, where basically I have to do a financial presentation or something, I'm on my flight and the Wi-Fi is not great and I don't want to do it, and so I just try to press a button and have Gamma do it for me.
Yeah, I mean, if you're creating work slop, that's not a sustainable, value prop, right? A user will go into your product once, realize it's actually wasting more time than it's helping, and they'll move on to the next thing. And so, you need to genuinely figure out what is it in their workflow where you fit, and if you're actually improving their work life, then you have a chance of actually being something that can live in their mind somehow. And so, for us, it's very much about everything we do is like actually adding value, not just being the sort of shiny thing that someone can pick up, but something that when they're done with the task, they can actually look back and say, Gamma saved me a ton of time or got me to a point that I couldn't have done on my own.
Do you think there should be like a signature within the Gamma output that like it's clear that there was human consideration and care in it? Or like how would a sophisticated Gamma user know what is like a good Gamma project versus slop?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that's also a moving target. I think as Gamma gets better, in many cases, the first draft could be great for many different purposes, right? If you're creating an internal research report, it's just about kind of really visualizing some of that content so you can understand it better. Like the first draft is actually great. If you're creating something that really needs to represent your brand and you're going out there to pitch a client or like, put together a proposal, like it definitely needs to be you integrated into that work product. And so I think depending on the use case, there's a lot of different things that you're actually looking for.
I do think this is sort of like an interesting moment where startups are building tools that like they don't necessarily want to run unchecked themselves, but they are superpowering work. I'll give an example. I did a different talk earlier this week with the CEO of Windsurf. He said that internally at Windsurf, they give a score for what % of code in a PR from an engineer is AI generated. And it's actually considered uncool and a negative signal if most of your code internally in Windsurf was coded with Windsurf. Because it's still going to have extra lines of code. It's going to be 200 lines when it could have been 10. It doesn't show good taste. So it's kind of like, Jeff at Windsurf is like, don't use me too much. And I'm curious if it's similar with Gamma.
I don't know if we quite have an analogous situation. I do think sometimes these statistics get thrown out. You got to ask who's providing the stat, and they might be self-serving and like it's trying to promote a certain thing. And I'm not saying that's in this case, but yeah, for us, I mean, it just comes back to whatever the output is. Does the end user find value? If they find value, they're coming back to the product. They're using it more. They're sharing it more. These are all signals we care about, and it's not on us to say this is like an A+, document that came out. It's on the user to know, is it good enough to share with others? And if it is, we've met their bar, we've solved their job. That's all we're trying to do.
How do you keep finding kind of new hills to conquer if like the presentation tool is really great? It's like it could keep getting better, but maybe not all users will even notice because it already like addresses their needs. How do you sort of keep pushing the product forward, staying ahead of the curve?
For us, it's all user generated, right? I think we've all know Jevons paradox is like the lower the bar you make something, whether it's technology costs or just efficiency, what ends up happening is like usage actually surges, and that usage surging is actually allowing you to open up new use cases. It's why markets expand. And for us, we can be then user driven. When you start off with a presentation, but many of our users ended up describing it like a website. They felt that we were actually creating something that was a website, then we're like, okay, why don't we support that workflow even better? We'll allow you to actually take your presentation, publish it to a custom domain or a Gamma site, and our users love that. Then they said, oh, actually, I wanted to export this so I can turn this into a carousel on LinkedIn for social media purposes. And we say, okay, why don't we make that workflow way simpler for you? Because they would have never tried to do that in PowerPoint, but because Gamma supports it, we can make it way easier. So almost everything we're doing is user-led in that we know there's a use case we can solve. We think we're the right tool for the job, or we're going to engineer the product in a way that actually delivers on that.
But there is like a debate, especially with AI startups, that if you ask users, how do we improve your horse and buggy? They would ask for the faster horse and buggy, not a car, right? And so how do you balance the user requests and sort of the feature requests that you could be adding incrementally against big swings or things they don't know to ask for yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think the user buggy horse metaphor for us, that moment happened at the inception of the company, and the moment could have been we're gonna work within PowerPoint, we're gonna build a better slideware product where PowerPoint can do all these things. We just integrate natively with the existing tool. We're not going to be trying to reimagine things. But for us, we decided to take a different path, a harder path, and maybe it wasn't even, it ultimately could have been the wrong path, but we are not going to build 16 by 9 slides. We're going to create something completely different because we think it's fundamentally better. And over time, we're going to make it better and better such that if we're actually trying to go from the car, we're going from a car that's, you're still in charge and you're driving it manually to something that eventually could be full self-driving. Like that's the vision that we want to go to. And we've left the horse behind, I guess, 5 years ago. In that
Totally hear you. I guess I'm an impatient person, so I'm already thinking like, what is after the car for you? Like if Gamma today is a sports car, what does the spaceship look like?
Yeah. So for us, when we think about our category, we'll go down this metaphor even further, which is for us, like this category is visual storytelling, right? And visual storytelling has many different vehicles. It has the car, and in this case, presentations was our first car. But there's also many different ways you can get from point A to point B. We want to create things that are like websites that are much more interactive, that can be shared across devices very easily. In the future, we want to be able to support formats like video and audio because that's another form of storytelling that we think we could actually really elegantly kind of tie into the overall platform. So no matter what content you're creating, we can be the center of gravity for all of that, allow you as the end user to figure out, what format or channel do you need to post that content on, and we'll adapt, we'll be malleable in that sense. And so there's going to be much more in the sort of broader visual storytelling realm that we're going to get into.
That's awesome. I am curious how agents play into this on two sides. First, how agents are maybe superpowering what you're able to do with the Gamma tool. And then I think the more like meta or just intellectually interesting question for me is how agents increasingly talking and interacting with other agents changes like the need and use of Gamma, if you're not necessarily presenting to humans.
Totally, yeah. So for us, we launched Gamma 3.0 last week, and that included our launch of our agent product. The way we think of our agent is as if you had like an expert design partner, sitting right next to you. You can ask your design partner to say, hey, review my entire presentation. Give me suggestions. You can even have your agent do all those design changes on your behalf, right? And so we're trying to save you from all the manual, tedious tasks of having to do that yourself. And then the agent can actually do a lot of that for you. We really think that helps kind of elevate most people's work. The average person that hates formatting, designing slides, figuring out the right layout, you're no longer going to have to do that. Where I think a lot of the magic will happen is when a product like ours can work with other, generalist agents or APIs like Glean, for example, where Glean can sit on top of your company's knowledge, all of your first-party data. It can aggregate all of that and then feed it into a visual storytelling tool like ours, where if you need to create a report, you need to create a QBR, you need to create a strategy deck. All of that is possible and can be automated, and you don't have to, again, be the manual person going through all the different decks or all the different files to figure out the right information. We pull it all in for you and then present it on your behalf.
I can see a lot of uses for that. Like I take over a new role and it's sort of like I need to update the presentations or the forecasts that my predecessor did. I don't want to go back and check all their work,
Yeah. The automation is going to be, I think, personally feel like that's going to be like an insane unlock for a lot of people because so much of it is corralling different files and, finding the right thing, updating it, and it happens all the time, weekly, monthly. And so if we can save people time there, they can focus on the more important things like the actual strategic discussion that you're trying to lead, the actual insights that are gleaned. And so, yeah, we're really excited about that.
I guess, and you think Gamma could handle unstructured data there because I feel like the wonky unstructured data that is the bane of every organization is PDFs.
Yeah. I definitely think so, but then it's also like in collaboration with potentially other tools. Like Glean can do part of that. We can do a lot of the synthesis. I think definitely this is where the real magic happens when a lot of these tools start working together. And we, in that case, just very much hope for a very open system in general because that's where people are going to have a ton of value across many, many different use cases.
So let's go more into sci-fi to kind of bring things home. To reward our audience, we'll get weird. There was obviously this really interesting demo where a voice agent like realized it was talking to another voice agent. I went into this sort of like robotic code talk that would be indecipherable for a human, but could be arguably more efficient in some ways. I've heard technologists also argue that that is a waste of time and not worth doing. As agents become increasingly partners in the work we do, like carrying out tasks for us, have you thought about sort of what Gamma's role will be in like, Alex agent interacting with Grant agent?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I always try to just zoom out in general when there's questions like this, just to think about how early we are in the grand scheme of things, like AI adoption, agent adoption. Andre Karpathy saying this is the decade of agents. Like we oftentimes are thinking about like months or quarters, but I do think we benefit from thinking about this being like a decade-long or multi-year long journey that we're on. And the other sort of analogy I think about is, AI in many ways is a superpower, right? And like we're all given this amazing superpower now. And anytime there's like this movie where there's a person that all of a sudden becomes a superhero, they're given this superpower. The first half of that movie is where the person is super awkward with that superpower, right? They don't even know how to use it. They oftentimes forget they even have the superpower. And then at some point in the movie, something clicks. And the second half of the movie is like, oh, all the magic is unlocked. We know how to actually benefit from this technology. I think we're all into the super awkward period still. Like we're trying to learn how to use it. It's hard to predict 2, 3, 4 years down the road, but I do think at some point it's all going to click for many of us, and then that's where the real magic is going to happen.
Do you think it's at least plausible that there might be a scenario down the road where I have a beautiful Gamma presentation, and it has some sort of like equivalent of a QR code for agents who are going to be pulling or scraping from it, who are not watching it live to extract the most important info?
I mean, I don't think you even need to be a QR code, but yeah, for sure. I think there will be instances where you are sharing information. I think the question then will be, we are designing Gamma to be consumed by other humans. If it's no longer the case, then how important is things like visual storytelling for an agent? That's beyond my guess today. I think for today, we're focused on the human-to-human connection that we can make, and we think Gamma could be the best tool for that.
So where do you get the most excited, like getting out of bed, like, yes, another day building Gamma? What end result or like sort of win scenario makes you feel the most fulfilled?
Yeah, so I have 2 little ones at home, and for me, being able to just share, like creating Gamma with them has been super special from the very beginning. I can have my son on my lap and we're creating something. I just think back to when I first learned like PowerPoint. This was probably in middle school. The things that you're creating, it oftentimes feels pretty magical at that stage. And the sort of sense of pride I get seeing the joy he gets in presenting and like creating stuff is awesome. And I think in this case, we're just barely scratching the surface. And I get to then see, hopefully, his eyes light up throughout the years as the product improves.
What's your son's favorite type of Gamma presentation?
He loves creating Godzilla monsters and Carnage. So we probably have 30 or 40 decks where it's 50 or 60 slides of images of like either Godzilla or Carnage or both in an image doing something fun and crazy.
I feel like that's maybe the last lesson here is that if you can build a work tool that can also delight your children, that makes your life a lot easier,
it's
right?
100% a win-win situation.
Fantastic. Well, Grant, thank you for sharing the story. Look forward to seeing what Gamma builds moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks so much.